Hello, Glenn
Hey,
Loury.
John McWhorter, how you doing? Welcome to the Glenn Show again, John.
Well, thank you very much for having me on this balmy day in the Northeast.
It's a beautiful day. Yeah, I get such pleasure out of saying that. You know, I never thought I'd have my own TV show when I was a kid. Oh, you mean this is not a TV show? Oh, okay.
Right, welcome to. Yeah, I've always kind of wanted to be the neighbor on a sitcom, so it's fun to be a regular guest and to be able to say, "Hi, Glenn." That's the way I always wanted to be.
Okay, John, both of our dreams have been fulfilled. Okay, so we're sitting here on Tuesday, the 25th of June. The Supreme Court has handed down two important decisions in the area of race, which is one of the things that both you and I write and talk about, and other such matters. And I thought we might just take a little bit of time here to sort of review the bidding, offer our views about what's been going on the legal and cultural front on race issues. There's also this big controversy over the Food Network personality, Paula Deen, a woman from the South who said some stuff that she wasn't supposed to say and is being punished for it and so forth. You've been talking about that. So why don't we do that? Is that okay?
That sounds good.
Great. Why don't we start with Paula Deen, because it's sexy. I mean, it's juicy. It's
and it's the goofier one, but it definitely has symbolic repercussions. I have a piece on this on Time's website. Actually,
you want to just describe the controversy? Excuse me.
Certainly. And so Paula Deen is a television cook and celebrity, and she's Southern and proudly brandishes that Southernness, and it's turned out in a deposition she made about an issue unconnected with what's going on this week, that she says that she has used the N-word in what she says is the distant past, and she recounts an episode in 1986, there's been some controversy as to how distant in the past that is, where she used the word when she was upset talking to her husband about having been held up by a black man. And then she has much more recently made a comment typical of something she says that are, if not offensive, just a little on the tacky side about race, such as that she was at some sort of banquet where, as it happened, all of the servants were middle-aged black men, and she found something kind of pretty in it. And so there was apparently a drop of the old Gone with the Wind nostalgia in her. She's 66 years old. And the Food Network dropped her on Monday in response to outcry over her having used the N-word. And the Food Network dropped her last week, at the end of last week. And Monday, Smithfield Hams, who she had an endorsement with, let her go too. So that's who Paula Deen is.
One more question about her personality. I mean, quite apart from racial commentary, is she known to be something of a loose cannon, something of a person who says the smart-mouthed thing or the provocative thing?
No, I think you'd call her the warm and genuine "y'all come back now" sort. And I don't watch cooking shows. I've always known who she was from seeing her face on book covers and reading about her occasionally. But I mean, if we were going to do a TV movie about Paula Deen 15 years ago, she probably would be played by Rue McClanahan from The Golden Girls.
I see.
In her Blanche routine. So that's the kind of person.
But her southernness, her regional origins are part of her shtick, I take it.
Yes,
it's Southern cooking, is it not?
Yes, included fatty cooking and reveling in it and decrying those who would say we shouldn't eat things like that as Puritans. She's that character.
Okay. Now, the use of the N-word was not the actual use; it was acknowledging the use some 27 years ago.
Yes.
Is that
yes.
accurate?
So it's not that she leveled it at one of her chefs or something. It's that she admitted that it was a word that she had used in the past, and like anybody her age at this point who's in the public, she says that the past is something that she has learned to get beyond, and she understands that things have changed. She doesn't seem to evince any deep sense of what these changes are about. She's a professional chef. She's not a writer, but she definitely consciously knows that we live in a new era. But she was talking about the kind of thing that she did say in what she was talking about as the past.
I see. John, I got to ask you, what's your take on this? Should she be excommunicated?
Well, I've seen a lot of these at this point, and there are people who call them teaching moments. Frank Bruni in the Times calls it one of those today. And my question always is, after a while, what does anybody learn? I'm not sure what the purpose these teaching moments are. You can go back to Seinfeld comedian Michael Richards, spouting off with the N-word when he got upset by a heckler during a stand-up routine. And
nigger is what I believe he was quoted as having said.
Mm-hmm. And this was all of, and it was all over the news. And well, here we are. What did we learn? Okay. And so he apologized, and I'm glad that he did. But as far as Paula Deen goes, I don't think that she should not have her show on the Food Network as somebody of her age, from her time and place, for talking about having used that word and what I do think of as the distant past at this point. I think that the apologies, and she did 3 of them on video, were enough. I think that we're holding her to a high standard of morality and enlightenment that none of us could live up to ourselves in many other ways. What do you think?
I see. Okay, I want to say a couple of things. First, on this age front, she's not that old. She's just a year or 2 older than me. So I deeply resent her being excused by age, because I don't think age is really much of an issue.
That's been said.
Okay. Having said that, what do I think? I think I understand why societies engage in this kind of behavior. The behavior being ostracizing and stigmatizing politically incorrect speech. I'm using this in the broadest possible, notion of political correctness. I mean to say that after a point, certain norms of what people are supposed to think get established. Polite, decent, well-meaning, progressive people who believe in justice and are on the right side of history believe these things. And societies tend to enshrine these beliefs, and protect them. And then when people differ from them, they punish them, they ostracize them, they call them a racist. And I think I understand why this happens. One doesn't want to allow flagrant violation of a historically hard-won norm of civility to go unremarked. To do that is really to undermine the norm. Start slipping away from. I thought we all understood that was in the past, and those views are unacceptable. This kind of thing. They could be views about women, about women's role in the workplace, or role in the home, or equality with men, or whatever. They could be views about religion. Okay? Dogmatic views that reject the teachings of science and that cling to now historically no longer, viable ways of looking at the world. They can be views about politics. A person was a radical left-winger during the 1930s, but it would be politically incorrect in the 1950s, likewise for a radical right-winger, and so on. So I understand, you asked me what I think, and I'm saying I understand why this behavior occurs. On the other hand, I don't imbue this behavior. The behavior I'm talking about is sanctioning politically incorrect speech with any high moral purpose. While it may be natural, it's not the same thing as, justice or whatever. I mean, the people who are going to hunt down every user of the N-word and ostracize them from the public airways are, in my view, not engaged in, civil rights advocacy. They're protecting a certain kind of conventionality and a certain norm, which, frankly, I think sometimes gets in the way of real justice. Okay? So, for example, while this is not Paula Deen, it could well be. Someone talks about the achievement gap in education, and they point out that African Americans lag behind. And they do it in a way that isn't attentive to every, little nuanced sensibility to make sure that everybody knows that they don't think that blacks are genetically inferior. They don't offer that disclaimer at the start. They don't say they do, they just don't offer the disclaimer. They talk about differences in the rates of violence. Homicide is committed by African Americans and committed by others. And they call attention to the racial disparity. And again, they don't offer the requisite disclaimers, and they leave it at least a possible thought that they might believe something that we're all not supposed to believe. And I think that kind of mild intellectual thuggery, by banning from polite public discussion anybody who doesn't conform to a certain set of norms. I mean, I think that that's a problem. Now, perhaps that doesn't apply quite so much in the case of Madam Paula Deen. I don't know, but I agree with you that there are probably many, many people who, when they think back over the last quarter century, will be able to report that there was a time in the heat of their emotional reaction when they used the N-word. Okay, I think there are many people, about whom that could be said. So, is it a hanging offense? I mean, that seems a little bit over the top. And I might just add this final thing: this kind of policing of speech is pretty much the only place where sort of the defenders of the honors of African Americans are able to take a stand and have some prospect of winning, as we saw from the Supreme Court today, which takes us to another topic. But I mean, there's a kind of wrong word. It's a kind of it's the strength of the weak. I mean, you don't have real power. You don't control any finances. You're not going to determine what the political outcomes are going to be. But darn it, you can police the speech of people and make sure that they touch all the right bases when they're talking.
I agree that I have two things I want to say before we move on about the issue of Paula Deen. One of them is that she, in terms of her age, when you're talking about somebody who's over 60, it's I mean, what in terms of whether that's old, that is utterly irrelevant here. What I mean is very simply this: she grew up in the Deep South in the 1950s.
Indeed.
When she learned how to talk and walk and think and had her first kiss. It was the world that we all just saw in the movie The Help, if we didn't read the book. That was her formative years. Now, when the 60s came and everything started turning upside down, by the time that had really happened, she was a 20-plus-year-old woman, all of which is to say that this is a person where her sense of race formed in a very different environment than ours. And even if there are things she can learn and new ways of thinking that she could start learning in the 70s, people harbor their formative experiences. And what you said about race and crime is germane. We are always taught to have the habit of thought of looking at any kind of disproportionate kind of commission of crime among black people, or black young men in particular, or anything that any minority person does that might be called less than healthy for themselves. And we are to think about where they grew up, think about what their role models were. There will always be the danger of falling into those patterns, and that's perfectly acceptable. But then when it comes to something like Paula Deen, where she grew up listening to people say nigger all the time, including people she loved very much, her own family, and the only black people she knew were servants, we're supposed to think that never after 1969 is she ever going to pop off with the wrong word or say the wrong kind of thing. Those kind of attitudes are like asthma or eczema. They're always underlying. We always say it. We always say racism is lying just beneath the surface. And so that means that if she admits to having popped off with something at some point, and let's face it, she probably did it more than then, and it was as long ago as 1986, and she sincerely apologizes, I figure, let her alone. Not just because it was the past, but because at her age, she's old enough that when she was playing pat a cake and putting on her first dresses, it was in this world that is completely different from what we know. And really, that's the one thing that I have to say about her. I just can't see that she, at that age, apologies really, but having known the 1950s in Georgia, the air conditioning is barely
I got
around.
it, John. Let me ask you this, okay? Because your argument could easily have been made on behalf of the Chick-fil-A guy who said something rude about gays and the moral status of homosexuality. I don't remember his name or what he said, but you know what I'm talking about. It could be said about many of these gaffes that have come up recently with respect to the moral status of homosexuality and gay marriage and all of that.
But they have religion that they're referring to, which is still very much a present thing.
I'm just saying the generational difference in attitudes about the moral status of homosexuality. I'm just saying that the young people's openness and acceptance of it, and the older generation. I mean, I grew up in Chicago in an African-American neighborhood in roughly the same years that Paula Deen was growing up, wherever she was growing up in the Deep South. And I can just tell you, I can just report to you that the way that people talked about gays and lesbians, I could use some of those words, but I'm not going to. Okay.
Right. It was just
was
normal.
Very, very universal presumption that the homosexuality was a
sinful, wrong, deviant.
Yeah, not just wrong, but I mean, unmanly and contemptible. I mean, not just wrong, not just morally wrong. That was really
but it's really
anyway. I'm saying all that to say, would you be willing to excuse such statements
different
today? Okay, so how's it different?
It's different because Paula Deen did not say today in some public forum, well, as far as I'm concerned, the black people were better off the way they were in the past, and we all just need to admit that.
Okay.
She didn't say that. She said, in 1986, when I was upset, I erupted with something. That's different from the Chick-fil-A guy proclaiming right here in the present that he has certain condemnatory feelings about homosexuals in contrast to what I think we can call enlightened people have come to think. They're different kinds of sins. If Paula Deen were 27, I'd feel differently. If Paula Deen had come up with this kind of language now in living color, if she had done a stand-up routine and started yelling and screaming, that'd be different. But I think that her case is basically just showing that she is a transitional figure.
How do you feel about the Confederate flag?
You dropped out. What did you say?
I said, how do you feel about the Confederate flag?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, about the celebration of the Old South, Gone with the Wind style. About the kind of, good old boy backslapping. It wasn't all that bad back in those days. We're not going to mention black people here, but, by lionizing the good old days, we kind of indirectly say, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've always had a hard time with that because on the one hand, what we're asking the South to do is not have any kind of regional kind of red meat pride in its past and its traditions. We're asking them to do that because so central to all of it was this subjugation of black people. Is it possible that a person from the South could really be thinking about barbecue and a certain way of talking and a certain way of relating and the weather and the kudzu and all of that and really not be celebrating the black pride? I think it's possible, sure. But then on the other hand, is it true that for a lot of them, quietly, especially when nobody's looking, they are also kind of liking the days when, quote-unquote, everybody knew their place? Yeah, there must be some of that. You see it in Paula Deen, and I'm aware that you're going to see it in people who are younger than her. And so it's hard to police the line. But you can put yourself in the mind of somebody from that region where they're being told, stop having any pride in what makes you different from other regions because of this stain that there is in it. I can see how there would be some resistance, although in my gut, the Confederate flag has a certain meaning, and it's hard for me to wrap my mind around it really only having to do with Bob Evans restaurants and, y'all come back. It's tough. I've never had a glib opinion about that Confederate flag issue. I assume you haven't either.
Well, I once wrote a piece back when John McCain was actually a serious presidential candidate. This was 2000. He was competing against George W. Bush for
good McCain, right?
For the Republican nomination, in 2000. And he was a little slow to take a position on the debate that was going on at that time in the state of South Carolina, because the South Carolina's Republican primary was coming, about the Confederate flag flying on state property in the Capitol there. And McCain made some comment about how his ancestors, some of them had served in the Confederate Army with honor. And I wrote a piece that was published in the New York Times that said, well, that's fine, Senator, and I stipulate that your ancestors served with honor, but that doesn't meet the point. The point is the cause was dishonorable. The cause was a rebellion against the duly constituted authority of the federal government, in effect, on behalf of the preservation of a way of life that, at its core, involved the institution of chattel slavery, an institution that treated my ancestors as animals, to be bought and sold, and that cause was not honorable. All right, the service may have been honorable, but I thought we decided over the last century or century and a half by now that the cause on behalf of which the service was offered was not honorable. And so what I just to get to conclusion, John, The conclusion is, of course, the South's history is what it is. And, of course, regional pride in the history of the South is a legitimate sentiment that Southerners might express. On the other hand, the historical narrative out of which they're carving that particular regional remembrance carries a great deal more weight in our civic life than just, New Englanders being proud about their flinty Yankee spirit or whatever. It involves the emancipation of millions who had been chattel, and the as yet incomplete incorporation of them fully into the body politic. And therefore, even as you're having some regional pride, deference does need to be shown and can legitimately be demanded from those regional admirers of the South. Deference to what is settled historical understanding about where the country has been and where it's going. So,
I agree with that completely, with the worry that as another generation comes of age, the response is going to start to be, I didn't do it. And it wasn't even my parents who did it. It was my great-grandparents who I barely knew. That's going to be a future problem. What are we going to do when people start saying, I had absolutely nothing to do with what happened to black people, even up into the 1960s? Everything you're saying makes perfect sense, but I think it's always going to be a tough sell in the South itself. Not always because of underlying racism either. It's a knotty problem, but I definitely see what you mean.
Well, it seems to me that in this voting rights case, which opinion has been handed down today, Justice Roberts' opinion that was agreed to by Scalia, Alito, Justice Thomas, and Justice Kennedy, which strikes down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which section specifies particular states and regions in the country to be the subjects of the pre-clearance of changes in their voting rules that has to be offered by the federal government before they're permitted to make the changes. And they're singled out.
Because of a certain formula, right.
They're singled out for special scrutiny because of the historical practices in those districts of limiting the access to the polls of black people. And the court has said, as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is the gist of it, that it is no longer acceptable for the United States Congress to designate those particular regions of the country as special and different from other jurisdictions in the country and subject to extraordinary federal oversight of their voting practices if the designation is to be based upon long historic practices of discrimination. Blacks couldn't vote there in the 1950s or the 1960s or whatever. Rather, if the Congress wants to carve out particular jurisdictions in the United States that will get special scrutiny from the federal government, it needs to do so on the basis of contemporary social and political measures, which could be applied to perhaps other regions and not just to the South. That's my understanding of the decision, and it does definitely sound to me like the court is saying 1965 was a long time ago. We can't keep these people being mostly the southern states, in the dock of presumptive discriminatory suspicion forever. If you're going to use federal authority in an uneven way to pre-clear the changes in voting practices in state and local jurisdictions, then you need to do so on the basis of criteria that are objective and that can be applied without special reference to the southern region, and what might apply in other parts of the country as well.
Glenn, do I take it that we both actually agree with that decision? I can't imagine you disagreeing with it the way you just put it.
I actually, and I've said it here on Blogging Heads before, I said, how long are we going to hold these particular regions of the this particular region of the country and these particular states and localities subject to this presumption that they are, in their motives, when they make changes in their voting laws, racially, there's racial animus in their motives. I think that it's outmoded to have done so. I think that similar arguments could well apply in other states, and that they need not apply. That is, the motives of racial animus need not apply when those changes are proposed in the South. So I say this. So the answer is Yes, I say it reluctantly because I know that, I'm not supposed to, this is political correctness. Again, I'm not supposed to think this.
And I think that we have to grapple with the fact that in the meantime, as I'm sure you're aware, an awful lot of people who can see themselves as representative of black thought are deeply upset and wish that this decision hadn't been made.
Including the president
Their
of the
feeling
United
would
States,
seem to be that it's too soon, right?
I'm sorry, excuse me for interrupting. You just said that many people who advocate African American interests very much dislike this decision, and they think it's too early to have moved in this direction.
Including our president and Eric Holder.
Including our president and Attorney General and, I'm sorry, was it Justice?
Eric Holder.
Justice, I'm trying to think, was it Justice, who wrote the dissent in the opinion? I can't remember if it was Justice Ginsburg or Justice Kagan.
You mean today? Yeah, it was Ginsburg.
Okay, and that dissent too holds that this is too soon to be done. Mm-hmm. And that's what people are going to say, and I frankly have no factual basis by which to have an objective judgment about how soon would be too soon. It's a little bit like Sandra Day O'Connor's 2003 thing. In 25 years, we won't need to do
25 years,
affirmative action. So how many years? We're 50 years now past 1963. We're 50 years past the March on Washington and King's eloquent address, and nearly 50 years past the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So how long is too long? I mean, I don't know, but this is a long time.
Something that heartens me about this, though, and this is pure anecdotal, but I think that in terms of discussions of race, people are very selective about what they accept as useful anecdote versus what is quote-unquote just anecdote. When I went down to Philadelphia for Christmas, which is where I grew up, and I spent Christmas, I had a Christmas dinner with my relatives, something interested me about that Pennsylvania city. Quite unbidden by me, various of my relatives, and it wasn't only just one, it wasn't the one who's particularly into politics, it was a lot of them, brought up that there were these attempts to suppress the black vote among Republicans, and they were fighting it. And I have to say again, these are not especially political people. A lot of them just got this from church, and they were saying this just will not do, and they were spreading the word around. They were indignant. And I thought to myself, this is the sort of thing that can happen today, and none of them are going to encounter any violence in doing it. And we're not in the South, but to the extent that there are still the kinds of problems that would seem to require the kind of address that the Voting Rights Act applied to all of these sorts of things, it's not clear to me that we need a Voting Rights Act today to solve what the very real problems are. I think that it's possible that black people can, for example, get the ID, even if it isn't fair. We can get the word out. We're not as powerless on that as blacks in the South were before 1965. And so that's one reason I have a hard time being as upset as the people standing around in Washington today talking about reversal and resegregation.
Now, I'm smiling over here, John, because I can recall during the campaign of 2012, when the Obama campaign was alleging, and others, journalists and civil rights advocates, that there were efforts, like the ones that your relatives referred to in Pennsylvania, to suppress the black vote, that I was saying, and people don't like the idea of requiring identification at the polling place because it could disproportionately disadvantage low-income people who are disproportionately minority and so forth and so on. And I was saying, let them get an ID, let them get a driver's license, and show up to vote. That was my thought. And I recall, John, if I'm not mistaken, that you were saying, oh, no, that's an undue burden on people, and it's not really fair to ask them to do that, especially when it has a racially disparate incidence. Did I recall that correctly?
I can't imagine saying that.
Oh, okay, so
I think at that same time I was saying it's time for us to go out and get the damn cards. And I've written that in a couple of places. Okay. So I don't think that was me.
I must have you confused with someone else then, because I definitely agree with you that I thought that discourse overplayed the race card in attributing to people who might be concerned about unauthorized access to the polls and who were advocates of requiring ID. a racial motive, a motive of, or even for that matter, a crudely political motive. We just want to help Republicans. We think whatever.
That's what it is, yeah.
And likewise here, I think, any change that a jurisdiction might want to make, which could have the effect, they used to call it a vote dilution, you know. Say we move to at-large election of representatives from a district-based scheme, and the effect of that might be to disadvantage minority candidates who were able to secure their election because they could get a very high rate of support within particular districts which were concentrated in terms of minority demographic. To move away from the district and toward the at-large election scheme, a person could say, and it might be true, would have the effect of making it more difficult for African Americans to get elected in a particular setting, but that's not necessarily a disqualifying argument against doing it. I mean, arranging voting criteria and detail so as to maximize the likely vote of the African American population doesn't strike me as a sensible long-term public posture. It may be necessary in the short run as one emerges from a history in which blacks have been excluded, but I believe that we have so emerged. So I guess that's where I'm coming out on this one.
You know what I firmly believe on this is that I think there is a certain kind of black person who is fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea that black people are not victims. I think, and I don't want to use this tacky business of just shouting out the non-word victimology just as sport, but I think that a lot of people have built tacitly a sense of black identity around victimhood, noble victimhood. The idea that part of what makes us good is that we're in battle against an enemy. Less charitably, you could call it an underdog complex, but I think that that's very much out there. And for a lot of people, the idea that there isn't that Voting Rights Act there standing in to purportedly protect us from the remaining racism that might keep us from being able to vote. For a lot of people like that, the idea, it's threatening, not because of any kind of power, but because it makes them feel, and I hate to refer to black people as them, but sometimes I have to because they're thinking in a way that really I missed somehow. They're thinking that this makes them less important. And I think that that is a kind of a distinction between somebody who happens to think like me and somebody who happens to think like them. I think in a weird way, they think of the eternal persistence of the Voting Rights Act as being something that should make black people feel good about themselves. Whereas I feel good about the fact that finally it's at the point where an argument can be made that it's not necessary and that that's what we did for ourselves to a considerable part. But there's that kernel of professional victimhood that I think colors the way a lot of these things are processed by a lot of very well-intentioned people. Do I sound like Shelby Steele?
A little, but it's okay.
I
don't think
that I can't get past that.
Steele, it's been a long time since.
Glenn, you had a dropout, and I want to hear what you just said.
I said, I don't think you're necessarily wrong because you sound like Shelby. And I was going to also say about the content of our character, which was Shelby's book from long ago, from the 1980s.
And I think a masterpiece.
From the 1980s. Yeah. It was very eloquent. It was almost like a little poem or something like that. I mean, it's a short piece, but it was profound in terms of the psychology of a certain kind of black-white dance that we were doing, a moral passion play that we were acting out with each other in the aftermath of the success of the civil rights movement and the onset of persistent African-American social disadvantage. I think both of those things have to be said. The civil rights movement was successful and it was over a long time ago, but the social disadvantage of African Americans, overrepresentation amongst those in prisons, underrepresentation amongst those at the Ivy League and other such institutions, and so on, high rates of family dissolution, child poverty, blah, 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 is a persistent fact of American society. And so reconciling those two things becomes a really difficult and, profound matter. And I thought that Shelby had some insight into it in that book from so long ago. About victimology or whatever you want to call it, about resting too quickly and too comfortably on the crutch of having been historically victimized, to the exclusion of addressing the contemporary circumstances that actually keep you at a disadvantaged position. And at the same time, imbuing the white with an enormous kind of power, because the white is made into the person who can become either the accommodating respondent to your outrage claims, or the diffident, indifferent, shrugging, I hope you guys do well. I'm not going to get in your way, but I also ain't going to break my back to help you either. It happened a long time before I was born. Responded to your claims. It gives the white an awful lot of power. So I have a lot of sympathy for all of that.
I think I understand where a lot of people are coming from because of all those things. And yeah, you have to stress that there are serious problems in the black community today that cannot be simply dismissed as, oh, that's just their problem, they're not good enough, they need to shape up. And I think we both agree about that. But in terms of what the voting problem is now, I just can't see that it's what it was in 1965, because it wasn't.
Let me put this on the table, John. I wonder how you react to this. Okay, so let's look at the Latino vote in contemporary American politics. It was extremely important in the last election. Obama won the Latino vote 7 out of 10, something like that. And in important swing states where the Latino vote makes a big difference, the fact that it broke so heavily for Obama made a big difference at the Electoral College. We have a debate about immigration policy going on now, in which the Latino community is presumed to have, on the whole, a certain liberal view, and in which conservative politicians like, I don't know, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and such are saying the Republican Party will be a minority party at the presidential level for decades to come unless we get this debate right, which means unless we fashion our responses in a way that will be acceptable to the Latino community. I regard that as having political power. Here's my point. The Latino community is, in principle, up for grabs. Republicans can actually expect to get some of those votes. Therefore, they have power. Okay? Real power. Not patronizing power where people acquiesce in your tantrum and the fit that you're throwing because it's just unpleasant to see you screaming that way. But real power, the kind that makes people go in the back rooms and give up stuff that they care about in order to placate you because they don't want you to take your vote someplace else.
In other words, the only kind of real political power there is long term.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The only this patronizing stuff, is no foundation on which to build your future. Have African Americans made an historic political blunder by so closely tying our fortunes to one party, and by resting on that party's, excluding the Southern hardcore Democrats who are almost non-existent now, but 30 years ago there were some, almost entirely on that party's willingness to cooperate in this tantrum-throwing, sort of political correctness flaunting, kind of moral thought policing behavior, which we have mistaken for real power.
Yes, I've said that, and it's obviously the case that a group of people who vote practically to a man for one party can never have any true political power, especially after a highly unusual moral moment, such as the late 50s and the 1960s were, has passed. And, I'm sure you've experienced this, or at least I certainly have. Say that at a public forum, and a black public forum, and you have people shouting at you, or not at you, but, kind of out into the air, as if you had suggested eating children, because black people simply can't vote for Republicans because Republicans are racist. And you can see columnists like Charles Blow or Bob Herbert who just love, sussing out possible racist connotations of things that Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney say. And all of that is basically about a 6-monthly call to the black community to never consider splitting our vote. And once all of that morality is expressed, all of it is very nice. And I say this as somebody who hasn't voted Republican yet, although I would if the right one came along. I thought about it. But it's at the point where, if that's the way it's going to be, we're utterly powerless.
There was a period in my life when I would have, and I did, vote for people like Ronald Reagan for president, and when I would have, and I did, work with people like William Bennett, who was a cabinet officer, and Bill Kristol, who was a pundit, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But to me, that in a way is not the point. I mean, I'm thinking about the cultural conservatism of the African American community. The fact that there's a high degree of religiosity. The fact that on issues like abortion or like the moral status of homosexuality, there really is a wide spectrum of firmly held opinion amongst African Americans. I'm thinking about, at least in a certain generation of African Americans, a deep suspicion about the implications of such heavy dependence upon welfare and such. I'm thinking about African American communities that are heavily victimized by criminal offending, and the sermons that some of the ministers in those communities give when they talk about the importance of having the duly constituted authorities of the state, that's the police and the courts, keep them safe from the depredations of what happen to be young black men who live amongst them. Those sermons have been preached. There's a guy called Eugene Rivers. He's a pastor.
I know him well.
And he comes on a local radio show, a local PBS show up here every Monday and does a kind of, week in review or whatever commentary.
I thought he was kind of fallen.
He was got difficult man to keep down. He was kind of out of favor for a while. He had a slot at MSNBC, and I think they cut him, and I'm not sure exactly why. But in any case, here's what not fallen in the sense of moral turpitude, at least not so far as I know. But anyway, here's the point I'm trying to make. So incidents are happening up here in Boston, drive-by shooting, kids acting up and doing stuff, 3, 4 found dead in the basement someplace because of drug deal gone bad, whatever, over in Roxbury, Dorchester. And Rivers is on a tear about how conventional African-American leadership, in this case local leadership, both us intellectuals and people who sit in the local city council and such, are silent about what's going on, and things are getting worse and worse and worse in terms of the violence and whatnot, and how one must speak out and must affirm what we know to be true, which is that this is no way for any people to live, and it won't be tolerated amongst us, even from our own kind. But I'm saying all of that to say, that's fertile ground, it would appear to me, for a conservative party to try to make some kind of inroads. And while I think you can fault intellectual and political leadership amongst African Americans for being kind of monolithic in their democratic orientation, you might also fault the missed opportunity of Republicans who haven't, perhaps as much as they could have done, attempted to mine that vein. I mean, a guy like Jack Kemp, whose name is barely remembered today, was the kind of Republican who would go into the inner city and ask for people's votes. I don't think we've seen that many since.
No, we don't see that enough today. For example, the first Bush administration, the second Bush administration, thought of itself, if you talk to the actual people, as a very pro-black administration during about the first 3 years.
Yeah.
But they didn't speak the language clearly enough for anybody black to really know it, unless you were paying almost obsessive attention. And I think of it as one of the saddest things in the world, and it ties into what I meant about that sense that part of black authenticity is being the underdog, that everything that you said clearly makes perfect sense. Black people might differ, but there's an awful lot of Republicanness about an awful lot of black people who would never consider casting a vote for Republicans, because the idea is we shall not vote for people who are subtly racist. The idea is if there's that subtle racism that you might detect in things that they say or things that they implicate, dog whistles, etc., then you can't vote for them because that has to be the defining issue. And as far as I'm concerned, no, it shouldn't be. You should vote for the person who shares the most of your beliefs, and you should have the confidence that that person's tiny sliver of racism is highly unlikely to affect you or your people in any particular way. But that is something I have no sense that our community is going to turn to that kind of thinking. And so we're stuck being increasingly powerless and trying to alleviate that by making references to the past and by being overly struck by the sonority of certain kinds of voices and oratory. But an era's over, and I really am not sure where things are going.
Okay, I got to ask you something else.
In terms of what we're going to do for ourselves.
Got to ask you something else. Okay, so there's a guy called Alan West. I know you've heard of him. He, for a hot minute, was a member of the United States Congress, but he lost his bid for re-election last time around in his Florida district. Now, Allen West is an African American. He's a Republican. He was given to making, and I'll paraphrase it, the following kind of speech. The Democratic Party has blacks down on the plantation. They can't stand it that a guy like me exists, a guy who's proudly pro-life, a guy who served the military with distinction or whatever, a guy who is black. Get white people to vote for him, a guy who, you know, offers a counterpoint to the one-note mantra that we've been hearing from black political leadership for nearly a half century, and they can't bear, they being the powers that be within the Democratic establishment, the powers that whether white destroy me at any cost. And that's exactly what they've done. My opponent raised money from whatever. And I know it's true. I mean, I know people who gave Allen West's opponent money because they were motivated by, you know, not wanting to see Allen West become this kind of Republican, sort of Clarence Thomas of the U.S. House of Representatives. Pardon me, Justice Thomas, but you know what I'm saying. Situation. So, do you agree that if an African-American conservative sticks his head up out of the foxhole and starts saying some of the stuff that 40 or 60% of African-Americans believe about certain issues, it deserves to have his head chopped off?
No, I do not believe that. I believe that the Allen West Herman Cain type is a type that isn't very useful because the way they talk whips up a certain kind of white audience, and it would be very difficult not to get a kind of a high from that, and it, you know, definitely gets them money for their campaigns. But talking that way will never move black voters, and people like that know it, and you know that's fine with them. We would need black Republican candidates who could speak in a way that might appeal to both sides, and I imagine that kind of person will come along. I'm not so cynical as to think that any black conservative who's prominent has to be somebody who talks about black people being down on the plantation and seems to not really like black people. We've seen that character a little too often. It'll be very interesting when a black candidate comes along who's as smooth and politic and introspective as Obama, but is a Republican and can defend it. I assume it'll happen. But Glenn, you're having dropouts. They're about to do construction below my office, and we can stop. I have to deal with a boring bureaucrat.
I got it, John.
So
let me bring us to a halt here. We did not discuss, and I think this needs to be acknowledged, the other Supreme Court decision, which was on affirmative action. The court decided not to strike affirmative action, but to remand the case back to the lower court with a mandate that they examine the facts to make sure that the use of race at the University of Texas passes the strict scrutiny standard of having there be no other way that they could achieve racial diversity without having to engage in racial discrimination. We should discuss that at some point, John. Affirmative action in higher education is going to be with us for a while.
I want to discuss it just after we see what this week's commentary about it is.
Sounds good.
Because I think that part is as interesting as the event itself in this case. But let's definitely do it.
Let's come back to it in 10 days or so.
Perfect.
All right, John. Thanks again for doing this.
Glenn, I'll talk to you soon.